When you think about the relationship between the UK and the USA, what comes to mind? The special relationship, right? Allies in world wars, shared language, and deep cultural ties. But what if I told you there was a time when these two nations were locked in a bitter, bloody conflict that nearly tore the young United States apart? A war that, despite its massive impact, has been largely forgotten by history. This is the story of the War of 1812. The forgotten fight that reshaped the destiny of North America and forever changed the relationship between Britain and America. Let's set the stage. It's the early 1800s. The United States is still a young, fragile republic, less than 30 years old. Across the Atlantic, Britain is a global superpower, locked in a titanic struggle with Napoleon's France. To win this war, Britain needs to cripple French trade, and to do that, they need sailors for their massive Royal Navy. So, what do? They start stopping American ships on the high seas and forcing American sailors into service, claiming they were British deserters. T's practice, called impressment, was infuriating for the Americans. It was a slap in the face to their sovereignty, a constant reminder that the British Empire still didn't fully respect their independence. On top of that, Britain was still present in North America, with its Canadian colonies to the north. American settlers pushing westward were constantly clashing with Native American tribes. Many Americans, especially the warhawks in Congress, were convinced that the British in Canada were secretly arming and encouraging these tribes to resist American expansion. They saw a chance to kill two birds with one stone: conquer Canada, remove the British threat once and for all, and secure the entire continent for the United States. It was a bold, ambitious plan, fueled by a mix of genuine grievances and a heavy dose of nationalistic fervor. President James Madison, facing immense pressure, finally asked Congress to declare war, and in June 1812, they did. The United States, a fledgling nation with a tiny army and a handful of warships, had just declared war on the most powerful empire on earth. The Americans thought taking Canada would be easy, a mere matter of marching, as one politician famously put it. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The initial American invasions were a disaster. One army surrendered at Detroit without even firing a shot. Other attempts to cross the Niagara River were beaten back by a determined force of British regulars, Canadian militia and their crucial Native American allies, led by the brilliant Shawnee leader, Tecumseh. These early defeats were a shocking wake-up call for the United States. Conquering Canada was not going to be a walk in the park. But the war wasn't just fought on land. On the high seas, the tiny U.S. Navy pulled off some stunning victories. Ships like the USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, because British cannonballs seemed to bounce off its thick oak hull, won a series of duels against British frigates. These victories were a huge morale boost for the American public. They proved that Americans could stand up to the mighty Royal Navy and win. The war also raged on the Great Lakes, which were vital arteries for moving troops and supplies. In a crucial battle on Lake Erie, American Commander Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a British squadron and famously reported, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." This victory gave the U.S. control of the lake and forced the British and Tecumseh's Confederacy to retreat from the Detroit area. By 1814, the tide began to turn in Europe. Napoleon was defeated, and Britain could now focus its full military might on the United States. They planned a three-pronged attack to crush the Americans for good. They would invade from Canada, attack along the Atlantic coast, and seize the vital port of New Orleans. In August 1814, the British landed in Chesapeake Bay and marched on the nation's capital. The American militia defending the city were quickly overwhelmed. What followed was one of the most humiliating moments in U.S. history. British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and set fire to the public buildings, including the President's house and the Capitol. President Madison and his wife, Dolly, had to flee the city. It was a devastating blow, intended to shatter American morale. From Washington, the British moved on to their next target, the major port city of Baltimore. But Baltimore was ready. The city was heavily defended by Fort McHenry. For 25 hours, British warships relentlessly bombarded the fort. An American lawyer named Francis Scott Key was detained on a British ship, watching the terrifying spectacle unfold. All through the night, A watched T-Rocket's red glare, The bombs bursting in air as dawn broke, he strained his eyes to see if the American flag still flew over the fort. It did. The defense of Fort McHenry had held. Inspired by the sight, Key penned a poem that would later become the American national anthem, The Star-Spangled Banner. The British failure to take Baltimore was a critical turning point. Their Chesapeake campaign had stalled. Meanwhile, far to the south, the British were preparing their final, decisive blow. A massive invasion force of veteran troops, fresh from defeating Napoleon, set its sights on New Orleans. Controlling New Orleans meant controlling the entire Mississippi River Valley, which would have crippled the American economy in its westward expansion. Defending the city was an unlikely, charismatic general named Andrew Jackson. His army was a hodgepodge force of U.S. Army regulars, frontiersmen from Tennessee and Kentucky, local militia free African Americans, and even a group of pirates. The British commander was confident of an easy victory. He was in for a rude shock. On January 8, 1815, the British launched a full frontal assault on Jackson's well-entrenched defensive line. The result was a catastrophic slaughter. The American defenders, protected by their earthworks, unleashed a devastating hail of rifle and cannon fire on the exposed British troops. In less than an hour, it was all over. The British had suffered over 2,000 casualties, including their top 3 generals. The Americans had lost fewer than 100. It was one of the most lopsided victories in military history, and it turned Andrew Jackson into a national hero overnight. But here's the ultimate irony of the Battle of New Orleans. It was fought after the war was already over. 2 weeks earlier, on Christmas Eve, 1814, American and British diplomats in Ghent, Belgium, had signed a peace treaty. News traveled slowly back then, and neither army in Louisiana knew that peace had been declared. The Treaty of Ghent essentially reset the clock. It returned all conquered territory and restored the borders to what they were before the war. On the surface, it looked like the war had achieved nothing. No territory changed hands. The treaty didn't even mention impressment or the rights of neutral ships. So, did anyone really win? The answer is complicated. The United States didn't conquer Canada, but it didn't lose any territory either. For a young nation to fight the British Empire to a standstill was a huge psychological victory. The war forged a new sense of national identity and unity. People stopped thinking of themselves as just Virginians or New Yorkers and started seeing themselves as Americans. The incompetence of the early war effort also spurred major reforms in the U.S. military. The Battle of New Orleans, though technically pointless, created a powerful myth of American frontier toughness and cemented the idea of westward expansion as the nation's destiny. For Great Britain, the war was mostly a sideshow to the much larger Napoleonic Wars. They achieved their main goal of containing the U.S. and protecting Canada. For Canada, the war was a defining moment. English and French-speaking Canadians had united to repel the American invaders, creating a shared sense of identity and a foundation for their eventual nationhood. Perhaps the biggest losers of the war were the Native American tribes. Their hopes of an independent confederacy were shattered with Tecumseh's death, and with their British allies gone, they were left to face the relentless tide of American expansion alone. So, why is this war so often forgotten? Because it's messy. It doesn't have a clear winner or a simple narrative, but its legacy is undeniable. The War of 1812 ended 2 centuries of conflict between Britain and America. Never again would the two nations face each other in battle. Instead, they began a slow, gradual journey toward the special relationship we know today, built on a foundation of mutual respect that was earned on the battlefields of this forgotten war. It was the war that confirmed American independence, secured Canada's future, and set the stage for the modern world. And that's a story worth remembering. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this piece of forgotten history interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what other forgotten conflicts you'd like to see covered. See you next time.